These notes are in Unit 6, Part 1, Causes of the Civil War. Today's notes will focus on the Wilmot Proviso, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Fugitive Slave Act, and also abolitionists. The Wilmot Proviso is a suggestion on what to do with the land gained from the Mexican-American War. As we know from our last unit, as a result of the war, we gained much of the land that stretched us from coast to coast. This included California, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada, and also part of Texas. So it was up to the country to decide whether these states would become free or slave, and this led to conflict, as the Northerners really didn't want slavery to go on any longer, and the Southerners wanted it to continue in order for it to boost their economy. In fear that the South would gain too much power, a man named Daniel Wilmot proposed that all land gained from Mexico would ban slavery. This was what was known as the Wilmot Proviso. It's important to know that the Wilmot Proviso never became a law. It was simply a suggestion. But the suggestion itself raised a lot of concern in the South and caused a lot of conflict between Northerners and Southerners. So, although the Wilmot Proviso did not pass, they needed to come up with some kind of solution for this land. Southerners threatened to secede or withdraw from the nation if California was admitted as a free state. So this became a problem because Northerners really wanted California as a free state, as it was a very large piece of land. Henry Clay, who's known as the Great Compromiser in history, proposed that the amendment was needed to protect states' rights. So he didn't want the South to feel like they didn't have any rights, but he also wanted the North to stay as well. So he came up with a compromise. This compromise, it pleased both the North and the South. Although California was admitted as a free state, Henry Clay proposed many things that would keep the South as part of the country. He said to the South that you would have no federal restrictions on slavery in Utah and New Mexico. So that meant that those two states would not have a decision made by Congress as to whether they would be free or slave. So it would keep some power in the states. He also said that slavery would be maintained in the nation's capital. So in Washington, D.C., they could still have slavery. This was considered part of the South at that time. Although they did ban slave trade, and that pleased the North. Also, as a provision to help the South stay, they did issue the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act was put into place so that the Southerners could capture their escaped slaves if they were to be found in the North. So it seems like the South maybe got a little bit more than the North. That's kind of up to you to decide. But they really did not want the South to secede. By the South not seceding, the North was really gaining a big economic counterpart. So the Fugitive Slave Act ended up causing more tension with the North than it did in pleasing both sides. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 allowed special government officials to arrest a person accused of being running away. They had no right to trial, and it also required Northerners to capture accused runaways if authorities requested assistance. It's important to stress that this is accused runaways. This isn't actually found guilty, and that's why the trial component was such a big deal. Because like we saw in the video, America, the Story of Us, some of these people were free. They were not escaped, and they were taken away from their families and out of their job places just because they maybe looked like someone that ran away. Abolitionists started to raise a lot of awareness at this time because they were very angry about the Fugitive Slave Act in the North. In response, one particular abolitionist, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was a daughter of an abolitionist, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a very controversial book. It focused on the cruelty of slavery and really opened the eyes to Northerners as to what really went on in the South. So this really got to people's emotions, and it started protest movements amongst women and also other people in the North to try to end slavery. So the book itself was written about the abuse of a slave owner. Like I said before, it did focus on the cruelty and abuse of that. It shocked people. It moved slavery from less of an economic problem into more of a moral issue. So people felt like these people needed their help. And Southerners were outraged by the book. They claimed the book was propaganda or that it was untrue in order to spread a message. So they were not happy with the book at all. This caused even more tension between the two. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was another way to determine how land would become free or slave, and it caused additional tension amongst the people. The Nebraska Territory was divided into two states, Nebraska and Kansas. Each state decided whether it was slave or free by popular vote. So the problem with this is that the Missouri Compromise did not include this piece of land, and Northerners feared that this effort to eliminate the Missouri Compromise would result in continuing power for the South. So the Missouri Compromise didn't come up with a solution to vote on whether this land was free or slave, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act said that it was up to the people. So there came a conflict there. And what ended up happening was very violent. Actually called Kansas Bleeding Kansas due to the violent outbursts. Basically what happened is that in order to create the vote in whichever side's favor, people from the North and the South flooded to this land. They moved there as fast as they could. And they did that so that they could cast their vote. They didn't want more Southerners to be there, so it would go in favor of slavery, or more Northerners. So with these two groups of people with very passionate views towards slavery, there was bound to be some violent outbursts. This continued to strengthen the tension and rivalry between the North and the South. In addition to raising the tension in Kansas and Nebraska, there was a man named John Brown who had many violent acts that occurred in that land. But eventually he shifted his motives to Virginia. John Brown was an abolitionist who believed it was his mission from God to abolish slavery. He led a raid in 1856 to an arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. An arsenal is like a building that holds a lot of weapons. His goal was to arm slaves with weapons so that they could fight off their owners and eventually be free. His thoughts were good, his intentions were good, but his actions were questionable. Locals found out about the raid, and led by Robert E. Lee, who would later become a very famous general in the Confederate Army, killed or captured all of John Brown's men. It was basically just he and his 5 sons. John Brown was hanged and tried for treason, so crimes against the country. And this trial itself split the country in two. Basically, people thought of it as a trial on slavery. He was trying to do something good, many thought, to end slavery, but he did it in a criminal way. This concludes the part 1 of the causes. We'll continue with more later on in the week.